Hello, everyone. We're here with Zoe Tabary, who is the property rights editor at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Welcome, Zoe.
Thanks so much. Hi, Yulia. Hi, everyone.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Thomson Reuters Foundation before we get started?
So I'm Zoe Tabary, and I'm the property rights editor at the Thomson Reuters Foundation on human rights issues, covering anything from climate change to trafficking, modern slavery, in my case, land and property rights. We also, as of recently, look at LGBT rights. And we do this with a global team of correspondents. So we've got more than 50 journalists around the world. And in my case, I manage a team of 5 journalists. So they're in Thailand, South Africa, the US, 2 in the US, and 1 in Georgia, Eastern Europe. And we also have a network of about kind of 30 to 40 stringers we kind of draw on from around the world. So quite a kind of small but mighty team.
Can you tell us what were the biggest property rights stories of the last year? What have you guys been covering?
The most obvious one, which I suppose would be not kind of one story, but a cluster of stories. So looking at, really the impact that the pandemic in this past year has had on land and property rights worldwide. I think if you take just land rights specifically, and we look at, countries from Brazil to Indonesia to the DRC, we've seen governments kind of really start to roll back environmental safeguards to boost economic growth, be it through commercial farming or extractive projects, which in some cases kind of threaten not just indigenous people, but also their lands. I think one big impact of COVID, and this is the case for several countries, on property rights has been, of course, the COVID-related shutdown of administrative and legal offices, which in many cases has kind of halted legal processes aimed at establishing people's kind of land or property rights. So earlier last year, for example, we looked at how hundreds of thousands of Iraqi women who had been forced to flee their homes during the war, how they had still not been able to not only return, but also prove ownership of their properties, as the title deeds that their families carried typically carried the name of their male relative, many of whom were killed in the violence. And of course, the closure of the courts due to COVID meant that there was this huge kind of backlog in hearings. And then I think finally, in terms of COVID, one of the, we often think of land and property rights in terms of physical land, but even just looking in cities and this from, the US to cities in Kenya, we've seen how despite eviction bans during the pandemic, and many of them were kind of renewed and extended, how families are still being threatened with removal from their homes. And indeed how in some cases the rate of those filings might even be speeding up. So I'd say, yeah, COVID has probably been the main one. I'd say another kind of big theme we've seen from the past year has been extreme weather events and just in general kind of worsening climate change. We've seen just this week and this past weekend how, floods in Australia, for example, are displacing people from their homes, but also how recurring drought, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa is fueling competition not just over land, but also over dwindling resources, and how that in turn kind of fuels conflict. And I think this is an issue that we used to think of as a very developing country issue, but we're seeing now even in coastal areas in the US or in Europe, how increased flooding, for example, is really putting the idea of what we call managed retreat on the table. So populations potentially having to retreat back to safer areas away from coasts and kind of rivers and other high-risk areas. And then just one third, I'd say probably area, and I'll maybe stop here, is racial inequality, I think. And, the George Floyd protests in the past year, but also just the global reckoning, I think, over racial injustice has really forced an important conversation on inequality of access to land, housing, and property, particularly in the case of, a legacy of decades of discriminatory policies. So just this week, for example, the Chicago suburb of Evanston is poised to become the first US city to offer reparations to Black residents whose families had suffered lasting damage from decades of discriminatory housing practices. And indeed, many of those communities have been shown to be, we were talking about climate change just before, many of those communities have been shown to be also more vulnerable to the effects of climate change.
So looking forward to 2021, What are you excited about covering on this beat? And are there any bright spots? It sounds, 2020 was a tough year. Are there any bright spots in the land and property rights world that you're looking forward to writing about?
I think one major one from this past year, and that I think will continue to develop, is the global movement to grant rights, legal rights to nature. So from Bolivia to New Zealand, we have, I think it's about 14 countries now that in some way have won the legal right for nature, be it rivers or mountains, to exist and flourish. So in just February, for example, we saw the Magpie River in Quebec winning legal rights for the first time in Canadian history, which was really hailed by environmentalists as a new way to protect nature from humans. In terms of other bright spots, and I think one thing that not just kind of the media, but also planners and campaigners in general will keep a really keen eye on, is how all of these kind of emergency or so-called emergency changes we've passed during the pandemic, whether they're here to stay and what will happen to them. So I think what the pandemic has shown that, many changes or policies that had been once considered either too expensive or too complex to do, how countries have not only done those, but done so in record time. So we've seen governments stepping in, be it for providing emergency housing or water and sanitation in ways that just hadn't been done previously. And I think that gives huge impetus and arguments, to campaigners for demanding that this kind of change happen, not just as an emergency measure, but as a structural change.